She used to say I had the wrong blood, foreign eyes, not our nose. I thought she was just a toxic old woman. Until one day the clinic called me, and my world collapsed in a minute. Growing up, I never really fit in with my family. Not in the way you'd expect, though. I mean, every kid feels different sometimes, right? But with my grandmother, it was like she had this radar for pointing out every single way I didn't belong. She'd look at me across the dinner table and just shake her head, muttering under her breath about how I didn't have the family chin or how my hands were too long or my hair grew in the wrong direction. My parents would always brush it off. Mom would roll her eyes and change the subject. Dad would make some joke about how grandma was getting old and her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. But I can see it in their faces sometimes, too. This little flicker of something when she'd start up with her comments. Like maybe they saw it too but didn't want to admit it. The worst part was how specific she got. She'd grab my face between her wrinkled hands and stare into my eyes like she was looking for something that just wasn't there. Then she'd sigh and let go, shaking her head. It made me feel like I was some kind of imposter living in my own house. I started avoiding family gatherings when I got older. Birthdays, holidays, any excuse to not sit there while she picked apart every feature on my face. My parents thought I was just being dramatic, going through some phase. They guilt-tripped me about missing time with family, about how grandma wouldn't be around forever. But they didn't understand what it felt like to have someone constantly telling you that you don't belong. College was a relief. For years where nobody questioned whether I had the right nose or the wrong blood. I could just be myself without someone analyzing my genetics over Sunday dinner. But even then, her words followed me. I'd catch myself in mirrors sometimes, wondering what she saw that I couldn't see. Was there really something different about me? Was I missing some invisible family trait that everyone else had? After graduation, I moved back home to save money while I figured out what to do with my life. The comments started up again immediately. If anything, they got worse. Grandma was in her 80s now, and it was like she'd given up on being subtle. She'd just flat out tell people at the grocery store that I wasn't really family. Embarrassing doesn't even begin to cover it. One particularly bad Sunday, she spent the entire afternoon pointing out how I ate differently from everyone else, how I laughed at different things, how even the way I sat in a chair was wrong somehow. I finally snapped and asked her what her problem was, why she'd spent my entire life trying to make me feel like I didn't belong. She just looked at me with these sad, tired eyes and said that she wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just telling the truth as she saw it. That sometimes the truth is hard to hear, but it doesn't make it less true. I was 24 and still living at home, still dealing with her constant comments, still feeling like an outsider in my own family. My friends were all getting married, starting careers, moving on with their lives. I felt stuck in this weird limbo where I couldn't even be sure of my own identity. That's when I decided to do something I'd been thinking about for months. One of those DNA ancestry tests that everyone was talking about. Not because I believed Grandma's crazy theories, but because I figured it might be cool to see where our family came from. Maybe find some distant relatives, learn about our heritage. I thought it might even help me feel more connected to my family history. The test was simple enough. Spit in a tube, mail it off, wait for results. I didn't think much about it after I sent it in. Life went on as usual. Work, dealing with Grandma's comments, trying to figure out my next move. 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was at work. The caller ID showed the lab's number, which seemed weird. Usually they just emailed results, right? But I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was professional but cautious. They needed to discuss my results, but not the ancestry part. There was something about my family connections that they needed to clarify. Could I come in for a meeting? My stomach dropped. I asked if something was wrong with the test, if they needed a new sample. But the person on the phone just kept repeating that they needed to discuss the results in person. Family genetic counseling, they called it. I drove to their office in a complete daze. The waiting room was sterile and quiet, filled with pamphlets about genetic disorders and family planning. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, maybe just some weird genetic quirk they needed to explain. The counselor who met with me was gentle but direct. She had my results printed out in front of her, highlighted and marked up with notes. She started by asking about my family history, whether I had any reason to doubt my parentage. I almost laughed. I told her about Grandma's comments, about how she'd always said I didn't belong. But I explained that we'd always assumed she was just being difficult, that families sometimes have members who look different. The counselor nodded and then delivered the news that changed everything. According to the DNA analysis, the people I'd called mom and dad my entire life weren't my biological parents. Not even close. The genetic markers didn't match up at all. I sat there in stunned silence while she explained the technical details. How the test compared my DNA to the profiles of my parents, who had apparently taken similar tests in the past. How the results showed no familiar relationship whatsoever. She suggested that there might have been a mix-up at the hospital when I was born. It was rare, but not unheard of. Babies getting switched accidentally, going home with the wrong families. She said they'd need to do more testing to be sure, but the initial results were pretty conclusive. I drove home in a fog. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. When I walked into the house, Mom was making dinner and Dad was watching the news. They looked up and smiled, asked how my day was. I just stared at them. These people who'd raised me, who'd loved me, who weren't actually related to me at all. I couldn't bring myself to tell them right away. Instead, I went to my room and just sat on my bed, staring at the walls. Every family photo, every memory, every moment of my life suddenly felt different. Like I'd been living someone else's story without knowing it. Update 1. I spent 3 days walking around in a complete daze before I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents. I kept rehearsing what I was going to say, how I was going to explain that their son wasn't actually their son. How do you even begin that conversation? I finally sat them down after dinner on a Thursday night. Mom was doing dishes, Dad was reading the paper. I asked them to sit down because I had something important to discuss. They looked concerned, probably thinking I was going to tell them I was moving out or something normal like that. When I explained about the DNA test and the results, they both went completely quiet. Dad's face went pale, and Mom just kept shaking her head like she was trying to make the words go away. They asked me to repeat everything the counselor had told me, asking questions about the science behind it, whether there could be a mistake. The next few hours were probably the hardest of my life. We called the lab together, spoke to the counselor, arranged for my parents to come in for additional testing. But deep down, I think we all knew what the results would show. While we waited for the confirmation tests, something strange happened. Instead of feeling more distant from my parents, I actually felt closer to them. They were dealing with the same shock I was, the same sense of having their world turned upside down. We were all trying to process this impossible situation together. Mom kept apologizing, like it was somehow her fault. She kept saying she should have known, should have seen the signs. Dad was quieter, but I could see him studying my face in a way he never had before, probably seeing all the differences that Grandma had been pointing out for years. The confirmation came back exactly as expected. No biological relationship. We were strangers who'd been living as family for 24 years. That's when things got really complicated. The lab explained that if there had been a hospital mix-up, there was likely another family out there dealing with the same situation. Another set of parents who'd been raising a child who wasn't biologically theirs. And somewhere out there, my actual biological parents might be wondering why their child didn't look like them. The counselor suggested we might want to consider reaching out to the hospital where I was born. They could check their records, see if there were any other babies born around the same time who might have been switched with me. But she warned us that it was a long shot. Hospital records from 24 years ago might not be complete, and there was no guarantee the other family would want to be contacted. I was torn. Part of me wanted to know everything, to find my biological family and understand where I really came from. But another part of me was terrified of what that might mean for the relationships I already had. Would finding my real parents mean losing the ones who'd raised me? My parents surprised me by being completely supportive of whatever I wanted to do. Mom said that whether I was biologically theirs or not, I was still their son. Dad agreed, saying that DNA didn't erase 24 years of love and memories. But I could see the hurt in their eyes too. This wasn't just about me anymore. They were dealing with their own questions about the child they'd raised, about whether they'd somehow failed to notice that I wasn't theirs. And somewhere out there, they might have a biological child they'd never met. I decided to contact the hospital. It took weeks of phone calls and paperwork, but eventually I got connected with someone who could access the old records. They were hesitant at first, citing privacy concerns and liability issues. But when I explained the situation and provided the DNA test results, they agreed to look into it. The process was agonizing. Every day I'd wait for a call, wondering if today would be the day I'd learn about my real family. My parents were supportive but obviously stressed. The whole house felt like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. Then one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was the hospital administrator I'd been working with. She'd found something in the records from my birth date. There had been another baby boy born within hours of me, to a family whose last name I didn't recognize. The timing and circumstances suggested that a mix-up was possible. But here's where it got really complicated. She tried to contact that family, but they'd moved years ago and their contact information was outdated. She'd managed to track down a current address, but she needed my permission to reach out to them directly. I said yes, of course. But as soon as I hung up the phone, I realized I had no idea what I was getting myself into. What if they didn't want to hear from us? What if they'd suspected something too and were angry about it? What if they wanted nothing to do with me? Update 2. The call came on a Friday afternoon. I was at work, trying to focus on normal things while my entire world was potentially about to change again. The hospital administrator's voice was different this time, more careful, more gentle. She'd made contact with the other family, and the conversation had been intense. Apparently, they'd been dealing with their own questions for years. Their son, the one they thought was their son, had always looked different from them. Different build, different coloring, different personality. But unlike my situation, they'd never had anyone pointing it out constantly. They just assumed he took after some distant relative. But when the hospital called and explained the situation, everything suddenly made sense to them. All those little moments of wondering, all those times they looked at their son and felt like something was slightly off. They'd agreed to DNA testing immediately. The administrator asked if I was ready to hear the results. My hands were shaking as I said yes. The tests confirmed what we'd all suspected. The boy they'd been raising was biologically mine, and I was biologically theirs. 24 years of mixed-up families, 2 sets of parents loving children who weren't genetically theirs, 2 young men who'd grown up in the wrong homes. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Both families agreed to meet, to try to figure out what this all meant going forward. We planned to meet at a neutral location, a family restaurant halfway between our 2 towns. I was terrified, not just about meeting my biological parents, but about seeing the person who should have been my parents' son. What would he be like? Would he be everything I wasn't? Would my parents look at him and realize what they'd been missing? The day of the meeting arrived gray and drizzly. I rode with my parents because that's what they still were, regardless of DNA. We were all quiet during the drive, lost in our own thoughts about what was about to happen. When we walked into the restaurant, I spotted them immediately. Not because they looked like me, but because they looked exactly like how I'd always imagined my parents should look. The man had my build, the same long fingers Grandma always commented on. The woman had my eyes, the same shape that had always seemed wrong in family photos. And sitting with them was him, the person who was genetically my parents' son. He looked exactly like my dad, same jawline, same way of holding his shoulders. It was like seeing a version of what I should have been. The first few minutes were awkward beyond description. We all sat down, ordered coffee, and tried to figure out how to begin a conversation that none of us had ever imagined having. My biological mother kept staring at me with tears in her eyes, reaching out like she wanted to touch my face but not quite daring to. What surprised me most was how natural it felt to talk to them. Not because we were biologically related, but because they were clearly good people dealing with an impossible situation. They were kind and thoughtful, asking about my childhood, my interests, my dreams. They wanted to know if I'd been happy, if I'd been loved, if I'd felt like I belonged. The other guy, I'll call him my genetic brother since that's kind of what he was quiet at first. He was dealing with his own shock, his own sense of identity being turned upside down. But gradually he started opening up about his own experiences, his own moments of feeling different from his parents. The weirdest part was how much we had in common. Not physically, we looked nothing alike, but in terms of personality, interests, sense of humor. We'd been raised in different families but had developed similar quirks and preferences. It made me wonder how much of who we are is really determined by genetics versus environment. As the evening went on, we started talking about practical things. Did we want to stay in touch? How often? What did this mean for our relationships with our respective families? Nobody had any real answers, but we all agreed that we wanted to try to figure it out together. My biological parents were incredibly gracious about the whole situation. They made it clear that they didn't expect anything from me, that they understood I already had parents who loved me. But they also said they'd love to get to know me if I was interested. The hardest part was watching my parents, my real parents, the ones who'd raised me, interact with their biological son. I could see the connection there, the way they looked at him with recognition and wonder. It made me jealous and sad and happy all at the same time. But something beautiful happened as the evening progressed. Instead of feeling like we were all losing something, it started to feel like we were all gaining something. Like we'd accidentally created this extended family that nobody had planned for, but that somehow worked. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to take things slowly. No pressure, no expectations, just a chance to get to know each other and see what developed naturally. The drive home was quiet again, but different this time. My parents seemed more relaxed, less worried about what this all meant. Mom said she was glad I'd found my biological family, that they seemed like wonderful people. Dad agreed, saying he was happy I'd have more people in my life who cared about me. Final update. It's been 6 months since that first meeting, and I can honestly say my life has completely changed, but not in the way I expected. The relationship with my biological parents developed slowly but steadily. We started with phone calls, then occasional visits, then regular family dinners. They never tried to replace my real parents, and I never expected them to. Instead, we built something new, a friendship based on shared genetics but deepened by genuine affection. My biological mother turned out to be an artist, which explains some creative impulses I'd always had but never knew where they came from. My biological father was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who listens more than he talks. Being around them felt comfortable in a way I'd never experienced before, like wearing clothes that actually fit properly. The relationship with my genetic brother was even more surprising. We started hanging out regularly, and despite looking nothing alike, people often mistook us for actual brothers because of how we interacted. We had the same sense of humor, the same way of approaching problems, the same random interests. It was like finding a missing piece of myself I didn't know I was looking for. But the biggest surprise was what happened with my family, my real family, the ones who raised me. My parents threw themselves into building a relationship with their biological son. They invited him to family events, started including him in holiday traditions, treated him like the son they'd never known they had. And you know what? It didn't make me feel replaced at all. If anything, it made me love them more, seeing how big their hearts were, how much room they had for more love. The dynamic between all of us became this beautiful, complicated thing. We'd have dinners where both families came together, holidays where we'd bounce between houses, birthdays where we'd celebrate with whoever was available. It wasn't traditional, but it worked for us. And then there was Grandma. I'd been dreading telling her about the DNA results. Part of me was angry that she'd been right all along, that her constant comments had been based on some kind of intuition I'd never understood. But another part of me was curious about what she'd have to say now that we knew the truth. When I finally sat down with her and explained everything, her reaction shocked me. She didn't say, "I told you so," or act vindicated in any way. Instead, she started crying, not sad tears, but relieved ones. She told me that she'd suspected something was wrong from the day I came home from the hospital. Not because she didn't love me, but because she could sense that something wasn't right. She'd spent 24 years watching me struggle to fit in, watching my parents try to understand why I seemed different, and she'd felt helpless to explain what she couldn't quite put into words. Her constant comments weren't meant to hurt me, she said. They were her way of trying to acknowledge what she saw as the truth, that I was a wonderful person who just happened to be in the wrong family. She'd been trying to prepare me for the possibility that I might find out someday. The conversation lasted for hours. She told me stories about watching me as a baby, how I'd react differently to things than she'd expected, how I'd seemed to be looking for something that wasn't there. She'd been carrying this burden of suspicion for decades, unable to voice it directly because she had no proof and didn't want to hurt anyone. But the most important thing she told me was that none of it had ever changed how she felt about me. I was still her grandson, still part of the family, still loved and cherished. The DNA didn't matter to her any more than it mattered to my parents. Family, she said, is about love and commitment, not genetics. We talked about my biological family too. She wanted to know about them, what they were like, whether they were good people. When I told her about my biological grandmother, a woman she'd never met but who shared her bloodline, she got this wistful look in her eyes. She said she'd like to meet her someday, to compare notes about raising grandchildren who ended up in the wrong families. That conversation changed everything between us. All those years of tension and hurt feelings melted away. I finally understood that her comments hadn't come from meanness or rejection. They'd come from love and concern. She'd been trying to protect me from a truth she couldn't prove but somehow knew. The really amazing thing is how all our relationships evolved. My parents and my biological parents became friends, bonding over the shared experience of raising each other's children. My genetic brother and I grew closer than many actual siblings. Even our grandmothers ended up meeting and developing an unlikely friendship based on their shared experience of loving grandchildren who'd been switched at birth. 6 months later, my life looks completely different than it did before that DNA test. I have twice as many people who care about me, twice as many places to spend holidays, twice as many shoulders to cry on when things get tough. Instead of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I now feel like I belong everywhere. The identity crisis I'd been dealing with my whole life didn't get resolved by finding my biological family. It got resolved by realizing that identity isn't about DNA or bloodlines or looking like the people who raised you. It's about the connections you build, the love you share, and the way you choose to define family for yourself. I still look different from my parents, still have those long fingers and wrong-shaped eyes that Grandma used to comment on. But now I understand where they came from, and more importantly, I understand that they're just physical traits. They don't determine who I am or where I belong. These days, when people ask me about my family, I never know quite how to explain it. I have parents who raised me and parents who gave me life. I have a brother who shares my genetics and siblings who share my memories. I have grandmothers who love me for different reasons but with equal intensity. It's complicated and messy and beautiful and nothing like what I expected my life to look like. But it's mine, and I wouldn't change any of it. The DNA test that I took as a curiosity ended up giving me the greatest gift I could have imagined, not just the truth about my origins, but a bigger, more complex, more loving family than I ever thought possible. And Grandma was right about one thing. Sometimes the truth is hard to hear, but it doesn't make it less true. And sometimes, the truth can set you free in ways you never expected.